June 6, 1944, shortly after 0430, mist clung low over the gray waters of the English Channel. And from the concrete observation posts near Cap Gris-Nez, the world seemed to twist into something unnatural. Cold, salt wind slapped against rusting rangefinders as German coastal watchers leaned into their binoculars, whispering that armored silhouettes were massing beyond the haze. Along muddy roads behind the dunes, officers of the 15th Army stiffened when field reports crackled through the lines. Entire columns of tanks appeared to be shifting across fields in the Pas-de-Calais sector. Yet no churned earth or tread marks scarred the wet soil. One jittery observer swore he saw the squared turrets of American M4 Shermans glint in the pale light, their forms hulking and motionless like predators at rest. In the bunkers below, the nervous smell of damp wool, oil, and cigarette smoke lingered as duty officers scribbled sightings into logbooks already thick with warnings. A radio man muttered that this felt too familiar. Another ghost army. Like the well-placed decoys before the Allied landings on Sicily the previous summer, when phantom divisions had stolen precious hours from Axis response plans. Outside, artillery crews tightened, jackets against the chill, and wondered why their commanders demanded restraint at the moment when decisive fire might be needed most. As twilight gave way to the first red smudge of sunrise, cryptographers in Abwehr listening posts cut through a storm of Allied radio traffic and froze. Encoded chatter referenced formation staging areas near Dover, training regiments belonging to a British Fourth Army, and fuel dumps clustered around Ramsgate, none of which appeared on German aerial photographs. Adjusted for the tonnage claimed in these messages, staff officers feared the Allies could surge nearly 1,000 landing craft at once, enough to overwhelm the very beaches Hitler had proclaimed impregnable. A staff lieutenant later recalled in his report that it felt as if a great tide of steel stood behind a curtain we could not lift. Runners clattered down corridors beneath the fortress city of Boulogne, where fluorescent lamps buzzed above strained map tables, and whispered rumors spread from interpreter to fire control chief that the invasion would strike Calais, the shortest crossing the place logic demanded. Panzer divisions, so precious by 1944 that their monthly production totals were parceled like rations to the front, remained chained to reserve status, forbidden from moving south until the fog of uncertainty cleared. By 07, more sightings poured in, some laughably contradictory, others chillingly consistent. Farmhands reported columns of trucks hidden behind hedgerows near Audinghen. Telephone dispatchers relayed that balloons shaped like artillery pieces dotted nearby fields. When reconnaissance units attempted to verify, they found nothing but suspicious footprints and the soft hiss of inflating fabric. Yet in the command caves at Saint-Omer, senior officers could not dismiss what crackled across their headphones: precise coordination signals, unit designations, and references to transport groups supposedly embarked in Kent. "This is too orderly to be false," one naval liaison wrote, unwilling to believe that such detail could be faked. Their hesitation, magnified at each echelon, stiffened the posture of entire corps that might otherwise have reinforced Normandy. Meanwhile, far to the southwest, real thunder rolled ashore. American, British, and Canadian troops pressed through surf from Caen to Saint-Lô, their assault waves ferried by Higgins boats whose numbers dwarfed German expectations. The measured clatter of MG-42 machine guns and the deep booms of 15-inch naval shells shook villages awake along the Cotentin coast. But in the bunkers of the Pas-de-Calais, reserve commanders waited, staring at maps that screamed catastrophe if they redeployed too soon. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's counterblows, already limited by Hitler's directive that armored divisions required personal approval to move, remained paralyzed by the phantom weight of invisible battalions. Reports later archived noted that even as the truth became clearer, many officers clung to the fear that a second, larger blow would crash against Calais once the Allies drew German strength toward Normandy. By midday, the illusion began to peel, but not fast enough. Inflatable tanks slumped, Misidentified radio beacons flickered out, and reconnaissance eventually confirmed that vast swaths of the supposed invasion force were nothing more than shadows and air waves. Still, the panic sown in the dawn hours lingered like smoke, staining operational decisions and clogging routes with delayed mobilizations. German diaries described the sensation as fighting blindfolded against an opponent we could hear but could not see. And as Allied armor crawled inland behind the beaches, analysts in Berlin struggled to explain how entire divisions had been pinned by ghosts. Those first deceptive measures, however, did not arise overnight. Their routes led back across deserts and coastlines to the experimental camouflage schools of North Africa, where the earliest Allied dummy armies learned to fool reconnaissance long before Europe trembled beneath phantom steel. July 1940 dawned harsh and golden over the Egyptian frontier, where the British Eighth Army first began to suspect that guile could be as valuable as armor. The western desert stretched in every direction, a shimmering expanse where distances swallowed entire brigades and a handful of tanks could vanish behind a single dune. Outnumbered, often outmaneuvered, and chronically short of fuel, Commonwealth officers realized that if they could not grow their strength, they could at least appear to. Near Mersa Matruh, engineers hammered scrap wood into frames and stretched canvas over curved piping until crude silhouettes of trucks and tanks dotted the sand. From 1,000 meters in the heat haze, they looked convincing enough. Support troops carved false tracks with drag chains behind jeeps, sketching the impression of armored columns slipping between wadis, suggesting flanking movements that simply were not there. When German aerial reconnaissance passed overhead, pilots photographed these flickering illusions through rippling air and dutifully filed reports estimating formations that did not exist. Through late 1941 and into the desperate months of early 1942, deception matured from improvisation into art. Commonwealth logisticians fashioned dummy pipelines extending toward the front as the African summer reached its height. From above, the lines suggested swelling reserves of precious fuel, implying that British armored brigades could sustain thrusts deeper into Libya. Radio chatter, carefully controlled and allowed to leak, hinted at reinforcements massing out of sight. As the First Battle of El Alamein approached in June 1942, these illusions misled sections of the Afrika Korps into preparing for blows that never fell. Panzer units repositioned defensively and valuable hours evaporated. After-action reports from Axis staff expressed confusion that British reserves seemed impossibly large, despite battlefield results that told a different story. By late 1942, these scattered tricks coalesced into a formal institution, the British A Force under Colonel Dudley Clark. His teams invented entire divisions on paper, forged insignia, and seeded rumor through diplomatic channels and controlled leaks. A phantom armored regiment could steer German expectations as surely as a real one, redirecting reconnaissance flights and causing panzer reserves to loiter miles from the true threat. Debates later surfaced about how many of these illusions directly shaped field decisions, but the pattern became clear. When the Axis misjudged British strength, their counterattacks faltered, and opportunities to crush thin Allied lines slipped through their fingers. These lessons crossed the Mediterranean as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Sicily, where deception would bloom into a coordinated campaign of false signals, inflatable landing craft, and invented orders of battle. The ghosts born in Egypt's desert sands were ready to haunt new shores. By the spring of 1943, the illusions born in the sands of North Africa matured into sophisticated engineering projects scattered across Britain's hidden workshops. What had once been canvas stretched over scrap frames evolved into standardized equipment built to deceive the most attentive Luftwaffe analysts. Technicians experimented with rubberized fabrics that, when inflated over lightweight metal ribs, reproduced the curved armor plates of vehicles like the M4 Sherman. At over 6 meters in length, these replicas mirrored the turret profile, barrel placement, and hull angles recognizable from thousands of meters in the air. Yet where a true Sherman tipped the scales at more than 30 tons, these decoys weighed under 150 kilograms, light enough for 4 soldiers to lift and rotate into new positions. On cold mornings in Kent and Sussex, crews practiced repositioning them as if preparing for exercises, leaving carefully arranged track marks carved with tractors to suggest continuous maneuver drills. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, typically cruising above 5,000 meters to avoid anti-aircraft fire, returned with photographs that seemed to confirm armor massing for an assault. The deception spread beyond tank parks. Dummy artillery batteries emerged along coastal pastures, their plywood barrels affixed to weighted bases to resist the stiff English Channel winds. Engineers calculated barrel length and silhouette to emulate standard British 25-pounders, the towed workhorse of the Royal Artillery. From above, the geometry of these gun lines, spaced at intervals matching real doctrine, hinted at fire plans capable of blanketing landing zones. Nearby, painted fuel drums arranged in measured blocks formed the illusion of swelling operational reserves. Such supply dumps, once glimpsed through reconnaissance lenses, signaled endurance, a promise that Allied forces could sustain prolonged operations beyond any initial beachhead. Luftwaffe interpreters scribbled notes about expanded depot capacity, feeding reports into a chain of assessments that increasingly overstated Allied might. Late in 1943, radio deception leapt forward under the Signals Research and Development Establishment. Their engineers crafted frequency-appropriate transmitters that echoed battalion-level traffic, harnessing timed bursts of encrypted chatter to replicate shift changes, supply queries, and routine staff coordination. Operators drilled on authentic pacing, mimicking the cadence of units rotating through training cycles. To reinforce the illusion, teams installed compact heat generators beneath tarpaulins, producing infrared signatures detectable by German sensors, attempting to discern warmth from machinery and fuel stores. These signals intertwined on intelligence maps until genuine and synthetic footprints became indistinguishable. Analysts in occupied France compared overlays and found no obvious discrepancies. Entire battalions seemed to pulse and breathe across southern England. Each improvement widened the gap between appearance and reality. Luftwaffe photo interpreters confronted aerial mosaics crowded with armor and artillery that simply did not exist, and their cautious reports pushed German commanders to allocate reserves against phantom concentrations. As Operation Quicksilver took shape, these innovations coalesced into sprawling deception complexes. Inflatable tanks dotted fields in irregular dispersal, decoy aircraft crouched on makeshift runways, and dummy landing craft rested along Kentish coves angled exactly as doctrine required. From the high clouds, the German eye saw armies rehearsing an assault across the Strait of Dover, a threat large enough to overshadow the true Allied preparations far to the west. Soon, these shadows would become the fulcrum upon which the fate of reserve divisions would turn. Early October 1942 settled over the Egyptian desert in a cloak of stillness, and along the barren ridges near El Umayyad, the British Eighth Army quietly rearranged reality. Under the relentless sun, engineers dragged canvas, piping, plywood, and paint into patterns that suggested nothing more than distant logistical preparation. Dummy supply dumps sprawled across the sand in neat grids, each barrel painted and spaced to imply gradual stockpiling for an operation months away. Southward, a false pipeline seemed to inch toward the front, its scaffolding deliberately incomplete, broadcasting, through the lens of German aerial photography, that the British were nowhere near ready for a major armored thrust. Real concentrations of M4 Sherman and Crusader tanks disappeared beneath box-shaped coverings that mimicked the tops of supply trucks, transforming lethal armor into mundane shapes. Meanwhile, along the more visible northern approaches, inflatable tanks and wooden frames took the roles of armored brigades, their silhouettes arranged just convincingly enough to satisfy. Impatient reconnaissance crews circling, high above the shimmering heat, each flight of Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes returned with photographs that reinforced the same conclusion. British forces were not yet poised to strike. In Berlin and in Panzerarmee Africa headquarters, analysts traced the pipeline's progress, just a few kilometers more each week, and noted the apparent lull in armored displacement. German officers, hunched over field glasses, saw only slow-moving cargo vehicles, unaware that canvas covered steel. Overconfidence settled in at headquarters, and Rommel's staff predicted that the earliest offensive would come in November. Through mid-October, British signal operators maintained normal radio rhythms, allowing Axis eavesdroppers to detect no surge in command traffic. Dummy tanks baked quietly under the sun, while the real armored spear rested camouflaged, hiding in plain sight. On the night of October 23rd, the desert erupted. In the black hours before dawn, a sudden British artillery barrage shook the valley floor, and from the hiding places where they had always been, previously invisible armored brigades surged forward. German command posts snapped awake in disbelief. Staff officers who had written reports of British unreadiness now scrambled to summon the 15th Panzer Division into motion. Orders collided in the rush to respond, and traffic jams clogged desert tracks as vehicles jammed into the same narrow arteries. Rommel, away in Germany for medical treatment, could offer no direct guidance. His deputies hesitated, their assumptions shattered. On the forward line, German gunners watched in shock as tanks they had never seen before churned through the darkness, their silhouettes emerging from what they had believed were harmless supply parks. As the battle unfolded, German counterattacks arrived too late and too disorganized to blunt the Eighth Army's momentum. Hours lost to deception proved decisive. British units broke through minefields and defensive belts while Axis reserves struggled to reposition. By the time the sun climbed high on October 24th, the illusion had done its work. At higher headquarters, Rommel's staff filed terse reports acknowledging that Allied preparations had been misjudged, a phrase that would echo in intelligence circles long afterward. The success at El Alamein cemented the credibility of deception among Allied high command. Illusions could delay reactions, misdirect reserves, and compress the enemy's decision window at the moment when every minute mattered. Buoyed by this proof, operational planners sought bolder possibilities. If wooden tanks and false pipelines could sway a battlefield, then entire phantom armies might bend a continent's defenses. With those ambitions in mind, the techniques pioneered here would cross the Mediterranean and mature into the next grand deception, one timed for another invasion that would shift the war's balance yet again. The days after July 9, 1943, unfolded under a pall of confusion inside German headquarters, as staff officers strained to piece together how the Allied landings in Sicily had slipped past their expectations. Intelligence desks from Athens to Berlin flooded with interrogation summaries, captured fragments of operational orders, and hurried reconnaissance reports from the Mediterranean. The picture that emerged was maddening. For months prior to the assault, dummy landing craft had lined sections of the North African coast, their silhouettes photographed by Luftwaffe aircraft and misinterpreted as embarkation staging for a Balkan thrust. Harbors in Cyrenaica pulsed with artificially inflated traffic patterns and choreographed supply dumps, while rumors, fed by double agents managed meticulously by the 20 Committee in London, whispered of British ambitions to carve into Yugoslavia. German analysts had no single data point to blame. Rather, they confronted a lattice of deceit that shaped a coherent false narrative. When the first Allied troops landed near Gela and Syracuse, too many Axis divisions found themselves staring across the Aegean at shadows. The rediscovery of deployment charts stoked bitter reflection. Among the units held in the wrong theater was the 1st Panzer Division, seasoned by years of harsh fighting and prized for its mobility. Anchored in Greece and the Peloponnese, it waited for a blow that never came. Signals intercepts had suggested imminent operations in the Balkans, and port activity, deliberately staged by Allied logisticians, seemed to confirm it. Luftwaffe interpreters studying aerial mosaics of the North African littoral reported concentrations of landing craft that, in reality, were little more than cleverly arranged decoys. Even when scattered reports hinted that enemy strength in Tunisia and Malta aligned with a Sicilian strike, the weight of deceptive evidence overwhelmed dissenting voices. The Allied paratrooper drops at Gela by elements of the U.S. 82nd Airborne, and simultaneous landings at Syracuse revealed that German defensive focus had fractured under the strain of false signals. Reacting swiftly should have been possible, But confusion at senior levels delayed orders, and coastal commanders hesitated, suspecting that Sicily might itself be a diversion for a second landing further east. As staff officers sifted through the debris of misjudgment, a troubling trend emerged. Dummy formations had grown sophisticated, supported not by improvising field units, but by dedicated deception specialists. German intelligence reports circulated warnings that Allied technology, radio mimicry, decoy vehicles, false port infrastructure was advancing faster than their ability to verify. The psychological burden on planners deepened. Every signal, every warehouse, every coastal buildup threatened to be a mask for phantom strength. Hesitation crept into routine decisions, slowing the ability to reposition reserves or concentrate armor. In war, reaction time was currency, and Sicily showed how swiftly it could be devalued. Among Allied circles, the outcome confirmed what desert experiments and North African ruses had already hinted. Deception could bend the geometry of a campaign without firing a shell. If a handful of dummy landing craft could pin divisions to distant peninsulas, then larger illusions might paralyze entire army groups. And so, with Sicily secured and Germany's southern defense disoriented, Allied planners began sketching concepts for a deception on a continental scale, one that would steer German eyes far from the true beaches where Western Europe would be invaded. By the opening months of 1944, as Allied staff refined the sweeping deception plans that would shield the coming invasion of Western Europe, the United States activated an unusual formation whose mission relied more on illusion than firepower. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, soon nicknamed the Ghost Army, formed at Camp Forest in Tennessee, where lectures on camouflage, radio discipline, and acoustic warfare replaced typical infantry drills. Its ranks included radio operators with exceptional timing, artists who understood perspective and shadow, and sound engineers capable of reproducing the roar of armored columns from mobile loudspeakers. Inflatable M4 Sherman tanks, roughly 6 meters in length, folded into canvas bundles that 4 men could carry, while imitation 105mm howitzers and rubber half-tracks assembled in minutes. In training fields, observers remarked on how convincing the silhouettes appeared when glimpsed from a distance, the false guns angled as if covering likely approach routes. Engineers knew the Luftwaffe often shot reconnaissance photographs from altitudes above 5,000 meters. At that height, the difference between rubber and steel vanished into static-grained black and white. When the unit crossed the Atlantic in late February 1944, it joined deception planners already weaving the broad tapestry of Operation Bodyguard. In southeastern England, the Ghost Army laid out rows of dummy tanks in hedgerows and orchards to simulate the assembly of armored divisions. At night, specialized teams unfurled mobile loudspeakers and broadcast the rhythmic clatter of track links, engine idles, and the occasional shouted order, echoing across quiet fields. German signals intelligence intercepted scripted traffic transmitted by operators who imitated the cadence, the handwriting, of real American radio personnel. Their messages referenced fuel requests, map grid changes, and mock inspections, all timed to coincide with the training rhythm of actual units stationed elsewhere. When Luftwaffe aircraft passed overhead, pilots photographed dispersal patterns arranged with doctrinal precision, reinforcing the illusion that armored brigades were preparing to lunge toward the Pas-de-Calais. These coordinated deceptions fed directly into German intelligence diaries, which recorded the supposed buildup of the U.S. First Army Group under General George S. Patton, an entirely phantom field army that analysts assessed at more than 10 divisions. Reports highlighted potential launch windows aligned with tidal charts favoring landings on France's narrowest channel crossing. Cautious staff officers urged that reserves remain poised opposite Calais, convinced that aerial mosaics proved their fears. In truth, the Ghost Army possessed no real combat strength. Its weapons could not fire, and its armor was filled with air. Its purpose was psychological, to anchor German divisions to the wrong beaches and stretch their reaction time until Normandy's true assault could break through. These movements, layered across southeastern England, formed the final rehearsal of misdirection before the most ambitious deception effort of the war, Operation Fortitude, took center stage. By the spring of 1944, the deception architecture forged in desert heat and refined across the Mediterranean reached its most ambitious scale along the southeastern coast of England. Operation Fortitude South, a pillar of the broader Bodyguard strategy, aimed to persuade German planners that the Allied cross-channel blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest stretch of the channel, defended by the formidable 15th Army. In orchards, farm fields, and coastal marshes, hundreds of inflatable tanks appeared in orderly dispersal patterns, their shadows shifting over time as teams rotated positions to mimic training cycles. Wooden aircraft, placed near airstrips at Manston and other Kentish fields, suggested that Allied air power massed for fighter cover over Calais. Painted mock landing craft dotted shingle beaches and estuaries, their silhouettes photographed by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft and entered into intelligence logs as indicators of looming embarkation. Behind the facade, dummy radio networks pulsed with artificial life. Signals teams transmitted scripted traffic referencing imaginary corps headquarters, supply requests, and rehearsal schedules. Messages were encrypted in familiar patterns, convincing German listeners that real battalions were cycling through briefings and field exercises. The double agent Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo, fed these impressions with painstaking detail, reporting order of battle information, troop strengths, and even morale assessments to the Abwehr. His carefully curated inaccuracies nudged German analysts toward the conclusion that a powerful First U.S. Army group, supposedly under the aggressive hand of General George S. Patton, gathered strength for a decisive strike at Calais. Controlled leaks, including meteorological hints pointing to favorable tides later in June, further encouraged the belief that any activity at Normandy would be merely preliminary. On June 6th, when Allied divisions stormed the beaches of Normandy, the deception's weight bore down on German decision-makers. The 15th Army, guarding the Calais sector, withheld critical Panzer reserves for weeks, convinced that a second assault would soon erupt across the shorter crossing. Luftwaffe flights continued to photograph dummy concentrations, their prints circulated as visual confirmation that Allied armor remained poised. Field reports tallied nearly 19 German divisions effectively pinned along a front that never ignited. In bunker complexes near Calais, infantry officers paced trenches and erected beach defenses against ghosts, venting frustration in dispatches about units frozen by intelligence uncertainties. Meanwhile, in Normandy's hedgerow country, the breathing room bought by deception allowed Allied forces to expand their lodgment, funneling fresh armor and supplies through battered ports. As July wore on, operations such as Cobra accelerated the Allied breakout, and deception efforts shifted inland to mask mobile thrusts and mislead German counterattacks. The success of Fortitude established deception not merely as a supporting tactic, but as a strategic lever capable of bending entire army groups. The techniques perfected here soon evolved toward more localized phantom operations, preparing the stage for the next wave of shadow warfare along the Western Front. In the unsettled weeks after the Normandy landings, German intelligence officers found themselves trapped between reports that could not agree. From makeshift headquarters at Châteauneuf-sur-Charente, field analysts pored over sightings of armored concentrations beyond the reachable combat zones, masses of tanks supposedly lurking behind the American front. Days passed with no contact from these formations, yet multiple reconnaissance summaries insisted they had been seen. The possibility that the Allies hid vast reserves just beyond view gnawed at planners already unnerved by the shock of June. Signals intercept teams complained that anomalous radio traffic, steady, disciplined and structured like brigade-level communication, emanated from sectors that should have been quiet. Operators attempted to triangulate origins but found messages dispersing across overlapping zones, as though the units themselves refused to sit still. The specter of the First U.S. Army Group, believed to be assembling for a Pas-de-Calais assault, still loomed in the minds of senior officers. The Luftwaffe added fresh confusion. Pilots flying from Belgian airfields photographed silhouettes of tanks near Faversham and Canterbury appearing in different locations each night. Analysts traced their movements across successive aerial mosaics, convinced that Allied armor was shifting under cover of darkness in preparation for a second landing. Reinforcing these suspicions, double agents continued to drip misleading clues about troop readiness, and German logistics staff warned that any precipitous redeployment might expose Calais to a sudden blow. Exhausted Panzer Lehr Division planners, still reeling from losses sustained in early July, delayed their own movements while headquarters attempted to verify which threats were real. Hesitation became contagious. Unit commanders relayed rumors that invisible American reserves waited to strike flanks the moment German armor committed south toward Normandy. This fog of doubt seeped into the 7th Army's sector as well. When American forces drove through the hedgerow corridors in early August, German planners struggled to divine the true weight behind those thrusts. On August 7, 1944, the counterattack at Mortain sputtered against unexpectedly strong American defenses. Intelligence officers had warned of multiple divisions massing there, yet others claimed the area was thinly held. No consensus emerged, and hesitation at critical junctions prevented newly arrived armor from concentrating with decisive force. Morton's failure left corridors open for Allied exploitation, and as U.S. armored divisions pushed toward Argenton, deception operators fed German command reports of threatening buildups along alternative axes. Counterattacks angled toward phantoms, while real enemy thrusts widened gaps in the bocage. By mid-August, rumors of encirclement spread through German ranks. Units already straining against supply shortages imagined Allied brigades maneuvering around their flanks, poised to seal escape routes. Psychological strain magnified tactical misjudgment. Commanders diverted precious fuel to reposition against threats that reconnaissance could rarely confirm. Deception messages highlighted activity east of the Falaise pocket, nudging counterattacks away from the corridors where German escape traffic jammed into deadly bottlenecks. As August waned, maneuver capacity shrank under the twin burdens of destroyed infrastructure and hallucinated dangers. For every confirmed Allied battalion, German staff officers imagined 2 more waiting unseen. By the time the Falaise pocket began to collapse, the psychological weight of phantom armies had become unmistakable, setting conditions for future illusions as the Allies pursued the retreating Wehrmacht toward the borders of France. At first glance, the illusions that misled German commanders in 1944 seemed to materialize overnight across the English countryside. But behind those silent silhouettes stood a vast industrial engine. In early 1944, factories in Birmingham quietly adjusted their production schedules, diverting labor and tooling to shape inflatable canvas skins patterned after the curved turrets and welded hull plates of the M4 Sherman. Stitching machines, once used for aircraft fabric, now seamed together rubberized panels, while carpenters cut 2-inch thick plywood ribs to form the skeletons of imitation anti-aircraft positions. Industrial records compiled that spring noted that more than 1,000 dummy vehicles had emerged from these lines by late May, each light enough for teams of soldiers to maneuver yet convincing enough to fool aerial reconnaissance. Within these workshops, paint crews studied photography of authentic armor, simulating shadowed slopes and turret gloss with careful, low-sheen coatings. Overhead, British air raid sirens wailed their nightly warning. Yet the dummy vehicle quotas remained steady, their silent ranks expanding on paper as the calendar crept toward invasion. Across the Atlantic, similar efforts unfolded near New York Harbor, where American factories converted peacetime rubber expertise into war's strangest manufacture. Industrial presses heat-sealed inflatable hulls, while camouflagers dabbed patterns meant to disappear into orchard shade or coastal grass. The process grew efficient. Upon delivery to a field site, trained crews could inflate a dummy tank in less than 30 minutes, anchoring its base to resist coastal winds. Specialized paints added phosphorescent sheen to mimic fuel spills, and decoy searchlights powered by portable generators threw thin beams into the sky. German night reconnaissance, hunting for operational clues, often photographed these staged glimmers, funneling attention toward positions free of genuine armor. In southern England, truck fleets hauled these deceptions across narrow farm lanes and through sleepy villages, scattering illusions in ever-changing dispersal. Their mobility suggested the relentless shifting of corps-level strength, reinforcing the idea that Allied formations swelled with fresh reserves. Berlin's intelligence branches watched this supposed industrial surge with growing alarm. Reports circulating through the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht argued that Allied manufacturing capacity for deception assets approached a scale that Germany could neither match nor adequately analyze. Shortages of aluminum and synthetic rubber, combined with strained Luftwaffe fuel allocations, limited German countermeasures. By contrast, Allied planners wielded cheap, portable shadows, scalable illusions that could be mass-produced faster than German analysts could verify. In the summer of 1944, as real armored divisions wound through the bocage and forced crossings toward the Seine, dummy units shifted inland to create screens of ambiguity. What German reconnaissance glimpsed suggested armor ready to wheel north or south at a moment's notice. These productions, born in workshops and delivered by convoys, became an invisible weapon, a factory line of confusion shaping decisions many kilometers from the front, preparing the psychological terrain for operations yet to come. By late summer 1944, as Allied columns rolled east through liberated French towns, the Ghost Army shifted from grand strategic theater to precise battlefield instrument. The unit's deceptive talents were now called upon to shield infantry divisions during vulnerable intervals when exhausted formations paused to reorganize or await resupply. In early September near Verdun, engineers and artists unfurled inflatable tanks along ridge lines overlooking narrow river approaches. Their rubberized hulls caught faint moonlight casting metallic illusions across the valley. Loudspeaker trucks, mounted with reels of pre-recorded engine noise, idled through the night, broadcasting the familiar growl and track rattle of armored companies rotating in patrol patterns. To German patrols probing across contested ground, these sounds suggested that the U.S. 6th Armored Division had entrenched itself. Reconnaissance teams, wary of blundering into tank fire, sketched cautious approach routes and withdrew to report what they believed were armored pickets. By the time the 559th Volksgrenadier Division received orders to test the line, its planners already envisioned an enemy bristling with steel. Their advance slowed and the counterattack faltered before it began. Through October, deception work migrated toward Luxembourg, where Allied supply depots bulged with fuel and ammunition destined for the front. The Ghost Army responded by simulating a buildup of artillery across hillsides, arranging imitation howitzers in doctrinal fire arcs. Painted muzzle scorch marks and carefully placed crates added plausibility. At night, flares and intermittent sound effects mimicked firing adjustments, feeding the impression of calibrated guns sighting in. German forces eyeing these rear areas delayed raids, fearing concentrated counter-battery response. Within intercepted communications of the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, Allied intelligence discovered notes of mounting exasperation. Officers could not distinguish illusion from lethal threat and ordered reconnaissance to triple-check targets before committing. Those delays bought precious hours for real units to reposition, reinforcing vulnerable sectors without exposing thin lines to sudden thrusts. The cumulative impact of these tactics demonstrated that deception had matured into a battlefield multiplier. When inflatable armor and phantom artillery multiplied perceived strength, commanders gained tactical elasticity, allowing smaller formations to hold ground while genuine combat power moved elsewhere. Yet the success also revealed a tightening psychological vice. German planners, recognizing their dwindling mobility, grew increasingly desperate to predict Allied intentions. Rumors swirled through staff offices that a massive Allied breakthrough in the Ardennes might be imminent, even as German high command quietly planned an offensive of its own. As autumn cooled into the hard bite of early winter, the Ghost Army prepared to shape perceptions once more. The next engagements would hinge not only on firepower but on the fragile intelligence assumptions guiding both sides. In the gathering shadows of the Ardennes forests, deception would soon face its most strenuous test. steering German expectations at the moment they sought to fracture the Allied line. By late 1944, the most potent effect of Allied deception was no longer measured in dummy tanks or forged signals, but in the minds of German infantry struggling to interpret every distant shape. Along soggy ridgelines and half-frozen fields, platoons peered through binoculars convinced that armored silhouettes crouched just beyond hedgerows, even when no engines idled in the night. Field reports compiled by staff officers described recurring anxiety. Soldiers who swore they heard the rumble of tank tracks on quiet evenings. Patrols who halted suddenly at the sight of a dark shadow that proved to be only a farm wagon. Attrition, fuel shortages, and the grinding exhaustion of retreat magnified these fears. When rumors spread of Allied armor materializing without warning, a distortion born of earlier rapid thrusts, commanders increasingly adopted defensive postures hours or days before genuine threats appeared. This uncertainty sapped the coherence of fire plans. Artillery commanders, acting on flawed sightings or intercepted reports, allocated precious shells toward dummy batteries perched on barren slopes. Those expenditures left genuine targets less vulnerable at critical moments. Intelligence staff, already drowning in conflicting reconnaissance summaries, strained to parse radio traffic that perfectly mimicked regimental cadence. Signals teams complained that enemy operators matched the customary pauses of shift rotations and the clipped phrasing of American staff drills. As the volume of uncertain signals grew, analysts lost confidence in their own ability to filter deception from fact. Even the Luftwaffe felt the strain. Pilots chasing indistinct ground shadows recommended extensive reconnaissance sweeps, but dwindling aviation fuel limited flight hours, shrinking the window for verification. On the ground, phantom threats multiplied. German infantry retreating through villages near the Rhine reported dummy roadblocks and misleading detours. These illusions fueled rumors of encirclement, tightening psychological pressure on units already brittle from combat. Company commanders hesitated to commit reserves, fearing that Allies masked larger spearheads just out of sight. Their caution, sometimes bordering on paralysis, allowed Allied columns to maneuver with greater freedom than raw battlefield strength alone would have granted. Among Allied troops, confidence grew. Deception softened enemy reactions, opening corridors through which real armor advanced. As autumn rains turned roads to ruts and the air carried the first bite of winter, German battalions complained that every night brought new apparitions. Convoys that vanished at dawn, guns that never fired. Cohesion eroded at the squad level, where trust in reconnaissance faltered. Deception planners, tracking the growing climate of doubt, prepared to reinforce this edge. They suspected, and Allied intelligence confirmed, that a major German counterblow brewed in the Ardennes. When that attack came, illusion would again weigh heavily on battlefield awareness, shaping decisions in a campaign where perception itself could prove decisive. By the closing months of 1944, the cumulative effect of dummy armies and deception schemes had rippled across the Western Front, shaping outcomes far beyond their modest physical footprint. The first and most crucial advantage emerged in June, when Operation Fortitude's phantom concentrations at Pas-de-Calais persuaded German high command to withhold precious Panzer divisions. Those delays allowed Allied forces in Normandy to consolidate their beachheads, mass artillery, and carve openings through the hedgerow labyrinth. When American units pushed toward Saint-Lô and later broke through near Avranches in July, they did so without facing the full counterattacking strength that German planners had originally intended. Fragmented intelligence assessments further eroded coordination. Counteroffensives, ordered in haste, collided with contradictory reports about unit strengths, prompting commanders to disperse their blows across too many axes instead of striking decisive concentrations. At the tactical level, artillery fire meant to blunt Allied progress frequently slammed into inflatable gun emplacements perched on hillsides, tearing only canvas and wood. Each wasted salvo reduced already strained ammunition stockpiles, a cost Germany could ill afford. In early September, rumors of armored columns near Brussels, fed by quick-moving dummy tanks and convincing radio chatter, dissuaded planned assaults by Kampfgruppen intended to choke Allied supply convoys. German reconnaissance troops, hampered by fuel shortages and thinning Luftwaffe coverage, failed repeatedly to discern which threats were real. Their uncertainty widened the gap between perception and reality. In operational briefings, staff officers debated whether enemy armor lurked behind forest edges or whether radio signatures reflected merely another Allied trick. Such doubt accumulated like frost, causing defensive paralysis at moments of opportunity. Strategically, deception fostered a creeping exhaustion in the German command structure. Wehrmacht staff officers, recognizing their shrinking reconnaissance capacity, clung to worst-case interpretations. Better to assume tanks where none existed than to risk catastrophe. That instinct, however, funneled reinforcements into sectors untouched by Allied offensives, leaving genuine breakthroughs underdefended. American armored divisions exploited these widened corridors along the Saar, breaking into areas where German formations arrived days too late to establish proper blocking positions. Allied infantry seized river crossings with surprising ease, encouraged by the knowledge that enemy reactions lagged behind events unfolding on the ground. Recognizing these cumulative advantages, Allied strategic planners expanded deception integration into corps-level operational orders. Dummy roadblocks channeled German traffic into ambush zones, while phantom artillery preparations suggested thrusts that never matured. Each illusion compounded the broader strain on German intelligence, widening the cracks in their battlefield judgment. Yet as the year waned and cold winds swept over the Ardennes, the rhythm of war shifted again. The Wehrmacht gathered its dwindling strength for a desperate stroke designed to fracture Allied cohesion. In that coming winter offensive, the psychological misalignments wrought by months of deception would play a subtle but significant role, guiding decisions in the last major battles to scorch the European continent. By late 1944, the limits of deception warfare began to show, even as its achievements remained undeniable. Weather proved the first and most persistent adversary. Heavy autumn rains soaked canvas skins stretched over inflatable frames, collapsing their carefully engineered silhouettes into sagging shapes. In muddy hollows, water pooled atop dummy tank hulls, distorting angles and leaving irregular shadows easy for trained observers to question. Low-flying reconnaissance aircraft, occasionally risking light anti-aircraft fire, swooped beneath cloud cover to photograph suspicious formations. At close range, subtle discrepancies, too perfect symmetry in track patterns, the absence of oil stains, unnaturally rigid gun barrels, alerted some German analysts that they faced illusions. As the front lines contracted in late 1944, the shrinking gap between armies increased the likelihood that ground patrols might stumble directly onto these positions. The Ghost Army, once shielded by distance, confronted the tactile scrutiny of infantry equipped with flashlights, boots, and skepticism. To counter these risks, deception units adapted quickly. Engineers painted tire tracks across soggy earth and dragged chains to mimic churned soil left by heavy armor. Soldiers scattered discarded ration tins, fuel cans, and paper wrappers to imply weeks of occupation. Simulated bivouac clutter, laundry lines strung between posts, overturned crates, even mock latrine pits, offered the mundane details that aerial reconnaissance often searched for. Sound trucks expanded their repertoire, broadening frequency ranges to imitate tank engines grinding across gravel, dirt, or cobblestone. Radio operators randomized transmission windows, reducing the predictability that German intercept teams tried to exploit. These refinements slowed the pace of German counter-analysis, though not without pushing the psychological contest to new heights. German intelligence adapted as well. Specialized interpreters studied the subtle cadence, phrasing, and timing, sometimes dubbed handwriting, of Allied radio operators. They searched for hesitations and clipped syllables that betrayed inexperience. Yet shortages of trained personnel and the constant churn of the front meant such analysis rarely reached tactical commanders in time. In early 1945, Allied planners pushed deception beyond hardware and into rumor. Civilian networks across Belgium and the Netherlands, already humming with war gossip, became vectors for misinformation. Stories of Allied columns massing behind nearby hills or stockpiling fuel at abandoned farmsteads flowed through villages, filtering back to German ears. Nevertheless, deception's power waned as German units collapsed toward the Rhine. Distance, uncertainty, and the fog of reconnaissance, the elements that fed illusion, thinned as the front compressed. Patrols found dummy sites more frequently, sometimes poking bayonets through rubber hulls. By March 1945, with Allied forces crossing the Rhine and the Reich's defense fracturing, dummy formations receded from the battlefield. Their legacy, however, endured. Staff colleges took note of how illusion-shaped strategic choice bent reaction times and conserved manpower. The war's final months revealed both the strengths and the boundaries of deception, setting the stage for post-war doctrines that would weigh shadows and signals as carefully as divisions and shells. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, the legacy of dummy forces did not fade with the smoke drifting from ruined cities. Instead, it settled into the doctrines of emerging NATO, militaries, and the intelligence circles, shaping a new geopolitical order. U.S. Army. Analysts compiled thick reports tracing how deception operations reduced casualties by delaying enemy reactions, widening the margin of safety for units crossing beaches or forcing river lines. British research establishments, reviewing wartime memoranda, concluded that synthetic battlefield illusions magnified the effect of limited armored reserves, granting commanders the ability to conceal vulnerabilities and maneuver with confidence. In internment camps across Europe, German officers admitted that persistent doubt, the suspicion that every ridgeline hid armor, proved one of the most corrosive burdens. Their testimonies underscored how deception gnawed not at steel, but at decision-making itself. In the decades that followed, defense academies incorporated these lessons into Cold War planning. Case studies of Operation Fortitude and its successors became staples of staff college lectures, highlighting how informational dominance could stretch limited manpower into convincing shadows. Military strategists debated how illusions might distort an opponent's internal decision cycle, slowing reactions just enough for real offensives to gain ground. The lasting imprint of these operations rested not in the rubber hulls or plywood frames left to rot in hedgerows, but in the fear they inspired. Fear of phantom threats that forced armies to defend where no enemy stood. Looking back to that dim dawn on June 6, 1944, when coastal watchers glimpsed shifting silhouettes through pale haze, one sees how uncertainty paralyzed entire divisions. Deception alone did not win the war, but it guided choices that shaped the battlefield. In the end, the story of dummy armies serves as a reminder that perception can be weaponized, bending outcomes long before the first artillery shell falls.